Department and the College of Humanities and Social Sciences and the Center for Women and Gender for supporting my work on this project and others that I've done. I'm also thankful for all of you for being here today. It is a great pleasure to talk about my work, and I'm glad that somebody wants to listen. I'm here to talk about my recent book, Transatlantic Literature and Culture After 9/11, The Wrong Side of Paradise. And this is a book of essays that examines U.S. and U.K. responses to 9/11. This comes out of a long tradition on my part of researching trauma and violence. From the time of World War II on the British home front. Oh yeah, okay, over here, that's better. Okay. From the time of World War II on the British home front to 9/11 on the American front. And as I told my kids that I was thinking about doing this book project, I had a kind of interesting conversation with them about it, and I wanted to read to you from the acknowledgments of the book because that conversation made it into there. And it kind of describes where I'm coming from with working on so much violence and trauma. So I wrote, finally, I would like to thank my children, Caitlin and Dylan, who have asked me how a person so happy at home can be so obsessed at work with violence and trauma. Talking to them about this book, I have realized that war fascinates me not because of its destructive power, but because of the creative potential it reveals in the mind's response. War's violence against the mind and body exposes the need for and the blessings of an aesthetic response to moral anesthesia. And so, to me, this is not about death and destruction, but about finding meaning in moments of horror and destruction. This book, oh, sorry, that was the quote from it. So you can read that. This book comes out of a previous project that I worked on British literature of the Blitz, Fighting the People's War. That book was about literary and cultural responses to the Blitzkrieg, or the bombing of the British home front during World War II. And that was a time that put civilians in the line of fire in Britain. And so that work shaped the way that I saw 9/11 when it happened. I was really thinking about American civilians, even if they weren't at ground zero, feeling like they were in the line of fire in what was soon to be called the War on Terror. And so I was thinking throughout the creation of this book about the connection between those 2 points in time. I wasn't alone in thinking this, and at the beginning of the introduction, I quoted a couple of people who said in the New York Times that they had seen this connection between the US and the UK. So British historian Niall Ferguson compared the World Trade Center and Pentagon bombings to the London Blitz during World War II. He said, "Viewed from England, what happened last Tuesday looked not like Pearl Harbor 2, but like the London Blitz." And that was in the New York Times a week after. And then there was another article a couple weeks after that in the New York Times where the author was comparing, was talking about how politicians had compared British citizens on the home front and the bravery of them being bombed night after night in London with what happened to Americans on 9/11. And so that idea was shaping this transatlantic idea in the book. But the difference between then and now really is the role that the media played on 9/11. And so at the time in World War II, obviously people, and this picture is from 9/11, but in World War II people were traumatized and were thinking about these events and reliving them in their minds. And that happened after 9/11 too. This police officer is obviously kind of circling through the events and locked into this kind of traumatic situation. But the other loop that happened was the media loop of watching those planes fly into the towers again and again, and we saw that over and over again. And that reliving and replaying the attacks, to me, seemed to really focus attention on ground zero and to make it seem like it was this uniquely American experience. And I didn't really feel like that was a good way to think about it completely. And so this book is to some extent about the dangers of American exceptionalism and about thinking about only us as being under attack here. And this is all on us. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how I came to the title of the book, The Wrong Side of Paradise in particular, but this is from the introduction, an explanation of the title of the book. So the collection's title emphasizes the need to refocus our understanding of trauma at ground zero if we are to avoid the political dangers of American exceptionalism. Built upon America's Puritan foundations, the idea of the nation as a kind of democratic paradise situates the U.S. as a moral, economic, and military force in the world at large. As F. Scott Fitzgerald pointed out in 1920, however, Americans are perhaps not actually in paradise, but just this side of it. The particular problem for America after 9/11 is that by appointing itself as the gatekeeper of an imagined form of paradise, the nation plays a dangerous game, much like that of the terrorists themselves. A condition of both never-ending bliss and everlasting death, paradise is a paradox worth considering in post-9/11 studies. The volume's subtitle suggests that America has perhaps chosen the wrong side of paradise since 9/11 by deciding to wage war rather than to seek peace. The structure of the book then tries to get out of this us versus them approach to post-9/11 politics by taking a broad look at 9/11. And so it begins with a section on empire, and then moves into the idea of a cosmopolitan city with Cosmopolis, and then moves into talking about New York itself, and going back to ground zero. And so it kind of gradually zooms in on ground zero. And again, I wanted to read you my sort of explanation in the introduction about how I'd structured the book, because I think that that says more than I can say in other reads about how I was thinking about the collection as a whole. The essays collected here look not only at, but also beyond our compulsion to repeat this moment of terror. Conceiving of 9/11 is both a unique American trauma and a shared piece of local, national, and global histories. The collection's three-part structure, empire, cosmopolis, and city, re-examines ground zero through the lenses of imperial power and cosmopolitan exchange. The volume zooms in through these three sections, from the broad idea of British and American empire to the growing sense of a globalized cosmopolis after 9/11, and finally to a revision of the devastated city of New York itself. Historicizing the attacks, and thus challenging notions of American exceptionalism, the book offers new insight into the persistent problem of representing 9/11's trauma. And so it does this by trying to draw together a range of critical voices and a variety of interdisciplinary approaches to 9/11. And one way that I tried to emphasize that sort of scholarly conversation was by ending each of the second two sections of the book with interviews and conversations with authors. So the second section, which is about the cosmopolitan city, ends with a discussion with Joseph O'Neill and his book, Netherland. And the final section about New York ends with a conversation with Spokane writer Jess Walter about his book, The Zero, which is about an NYPD cop with PTSD. And that kind of conversation to me started to feel not just like a humanistic obligation, but also like a civic obligation. And as I was working on this book, I was also working on another project at the same time on the 9/11 report. And I wanted to just share with you a quote from that project to sort of demonstrate to you how I saw the 9/11 Commission themselves sort of linking the defense of the nation after 9/11 with the defense of the humanities. The way they talk about it, there's a kind of a political storytelling that's going on. And this is a long quote from the beginning of chapter 11. So they've written 10 chapters about what happened on 9/11. And this chapter, they're sort of looking back at what they've written and talking about it. And it's a very self-conscious beginning. This is all one paragraph over 3 slides. So they say, in composing this narrative, we have tried to remember that we write with the benefit and the handicap of hindsight. So they're talking about in composing a narrative, they're writing a story here. Hindsight can sometimes see the past clearly with 20/20 vision, but the path of what happened is so brightly lit that it places everything else more deeply in shadow. So they're using a metaphor here to kind of bring the storytelling to life. It's not just a list of the facts, but a sort of a story that they're constructing here. In the next part of the quote, they really kind of compare this idea of fact-gathering, documentation, with imagination and storytelling. And they say as time passes, more documents become available, and the bare facts of what happened become still clearer. Yet the picture of how those things happened becomes harder to reimagine as that past world, with its preoccupations and uncertainty, recedes, and the remaining memories of it become colored by what happened and what was written about it later. So there's this idea that once you tell the story, it becomes hard to retell it. The imagining of it becomes the story itself. And so then the quote finishes out with them taking that caution to heart and really trying to be ethical storytellers as they are in this government report. And so they say, with that caution in mind, we asked ourselves, before we judged others, whether the insights that seemed apparent now would really have been meaningful at the time, given the limits of what people then could reasonably have known and done. We believe that the 9/11 attacks revealed 4 kinds of failures: in imagination, policy, capabilities, and management. And I think that the fact that they end with, that they begin with imagination here is really important. Their self-conscious storytelling is modeling for readers how to think more, to take civic responsibility, to think critically and imaginatively about the various national narratives that could be and are told. And so that kind of brings me back to the acknowledgments of the book and the reason that I was engaged in this. I mean, I really think that the interesting thing about violence is our aesthetic response to it, the stories that we tell about the violence that happens to us. And when even a government report becomes a self-conscious act of storytelling, I think that the role of the humanities in contemporary culture becomes crucial and clear. So this recent book, as well as my other work, focuses on our civic and global responsibility to be thoughtful readers and writers of these political stories.